Hello everyone, welcome to the Ultra Dynamics channel. My name is Wael Hamze and today I'm going to be talking to you about connection references. If you have projects where you're utilizing Power Automate flows as part of your solutions and you are importing your solutions into your downstream environments and want to know how to configure your connections and connection references in your pipelines, hopefully you will find this video useful today. So here is the agenda for today's video. So I'm gonna give a little bit of an introduction into connections, and then we talk about connection references, and I'm gonna finish the video by showing you how to configure connection references in your pipelines utilizing Azure DevOps, and some of the DevOps tools are available as well. So let's start by talking about connections. So basically, when you're building a Power Automate flow or a Power App, basically you have a variety of connectors that allow you to access multiple services and data sources. So basically, a connection is a way to basically connect into these services. If you're building a Power Automate flow, for example, you can connect into Dataverse or Microsoft SharePoint or Microsoft OneDrive. And to be able to connect to these services using a connector, you need to create a connection. And typically, when you create a connection, you basically need to provide some way of authenticating into these services. So, for example, if you're using the Dataverse connector, you can use the currently logged in user, or you can use a service principal to connect into Dataverse. So, connection you typically would have some authentication associated with it. The other thing is the connection has an owner. So typically the person who creates the connection will be by default the owner of the connection. And then you can also have the ability to share connections. So once a connection is created, so if I create a connection, for example, and I want to share it, I could share it with another service principal, and that allows the service principal as well, which typically would run in pipelines, to have access to that connection. So I can do things like activate flows using that service principal as well. And finally, connections are not solution aware. So that means you can't put a solution in a connection. So connections are basically unique per environment. So you create the connection for that specific environment, and that connection can only be used in that environment as well. And the final point that I wanted to mention as well is that currently you can't automatically create connections using an API. So that means you have to basically log into the Power Apps Maker portal and create the connections manually before you can use them in pipelines. Let's talk about connection references now. So basically, the idea behind connection references is to decouple the app or the flow from the connection itself. So the connection is environment specific, but the connection reference isn't environment specific. Not so long ago, you used to have flows that are directly bound into a connection. So when we used to import the flow into, for example, the UAT environment, we then had to basically make a change to the flow to repoint the connection to the right connection for that environment, and that resulted in an unmanaged layer. So the idea behind connection references is basically to decouple that relationship between the flow and the connection itself. So connection references are solution aware, so you can move them as part of the solution itself. And basically you can reuse connection references. So if you create a connection reference to, let's say, a Dataverse connector, you can reuse that connection reference from multiple flows. So you don't have to have different connection references for the same connector. And obviously connection references can then be linked to connections. So basically this is how it looks like. So you've got a solution, let's say in your dev environment, and you build a Power Automate flow, and then that Power Automate flow, once you, for example, connect into Dataverse or into Microsoft SharePoint as an example, you will have a connection reference created. and then that flow would be linked to that connection reference, and both these two components would sit within the solution, let's say in the dev environment. So when you move that solution then to another environment, then the flow and the connection reference move as part of the solution. So then once the solution basically is in the target environment, then you need to basically link the connection reference into the connection. So you would create the connection and then you would link the connection reference to the connection. So now your flow in this case is fully working because it's got the right links to the connection reference and the connection at the same time. So let's go into demo so I can show you how this actually works and how you can create pipelines for that. So I am in my dev environment and I have the XRM CI sample solution open. So this is the solution I'm going to use to demonstrate how to use connection references. So inside this solution, I have two cloud flows. So the first one is the create task for contact, which basically creates a task whenever a new contact is created. And this flow uses the Microsoft Dataverse connector. And I've also got another flow which basically retrieves user information from the Azure Active Directory, and it uses the Office 365 users connector and the Microsoft Dataverse connector as well. So but my goal is to basically take this solution from the dev environment into the production environment, but at the same time make sure that these flows get correctly wired to the connections in the production environment. So just to show you, if I was to do this manually from the UI, so I've got the solution exported from the dev environment. So if I click on next, it's going to ask me to confirm a few details, but then I get this screen pop up, which basically asks me to link the connection references to the connections in the target environment. So if you already have a connection in the with that user created, then it will show you whether you want to reuse that connection. If you don't have a connection, you obviously have the option to create a new connection. So once you select the right connections after the import, these connection references that you can see on the screen would be basically wired to the connections in that production environment. And you can see the names of these connection references here basically are matching to the connection references that we have inside the solution, which are, as you can see, they're also included in the solution that we're going to export and import to the production environment. This demo, I'm going to assume that you know how to basically export and import a solution using Azure DevOps pipelines. So I'm just going to focus on how to manage the connection references. So this is my release pipeline, which takes a build that produces the solution. And the idea is to deploy the solution and configure the connection references in this production environment. So as you can see, I don't have a lot of steps at the moment. So there is two ways basically in which you can configure connection references, and I'm going to show you these today in the demo. So the first one is using the Power Platform build tools. So if we look at the import solution task, you have the standard configuration, which is the service connection, the solution that you want to import. In addition to that, you see there is another option here called use deployment settings file. So if you tick this option, you will have the ability to supply basically a JSON file that contains the information about the connection references. So let's take a look at how you can produce this JSON file with the right information. So one way to generate the deployment settings JSON file is to use the pack CLI. So I created a script which basically generates the configuration file using the solution. So there are two commands that you have to do. So one is to export the solution. So you specify the zip file and the name of the solution, and this will basically export the solution from your dev environment. And the other one is to basically create the JSON file using that solution. So there's another command in the pack CLI, which is basically called create settings, and that takes the solution and creates the deployment settings file. This command actually accepts a different parameter, which is the unpacked solution file. So if you have your solution file in version control as well, you could use that instead. But for this demo, I decided to export the solution and utilize that. So once you run this command in the pack CLI, these two commands, you basically get a JSON file which looks like this. So inside this file, you have two things. One of them is the environment variables, and the other one is the connection references. So let's focus on the connection references for today. So you can see basically this is a mapping file. So you got the logical name of the connection reference, and then you have the connector that this connection reference is relating to. So we have here the basically the Dataverse connector and the Office 365 users connector. As you can see, the connection IDs are blank at the moment. You may have configured the connections in the dev environment, but in this file, they come as blank. So the idea then is to use that file and have the right connection IDs here for the right environment. So there is two ways normally to do it. So one of them is to have basically different configuration files based on the environment. So for example, you could have a deployment settings file for UAT, and you can have a deployment settings file for production. And then depending on which environment you're deploying to, you can pass the right file. The other way to do it is to basically make this file dynamic and then provide the parameters for these connections during the deployment, which is the option I'm going to be using in today's demo. So this is the default file that comes out from the pack CLI. So I've taken a copy of the contents of this file and I've created another file which I'm going to be used in the pipelines. So in this file, I've populated the connection IDs with some parameters that I will be looking to replace during the pipeline execution, which I'm going to show you how to do in a bit. So basically at this stage, I've got a JSON file that is ready to be used in the pipelines, and you can see I've basically committed this version file. I've committed this JSON file to the repository, so then I can basically utilize it in my build and release pipelines. So this is the build pipeline that basically generates the solution. So as you can see, I'm using the Power Platform build tools, and this is fairly standard. So I just set the version to the build number, and then I export the solution using the service principal connection as a managed solution. Basically, the file that I've checked in, which is the deployment settings file, is in my repo. And by the way, this repo is on GitHub, so you can log into GitHub and you can look at the script to generate the file and the sample configuration file as well. So the only thing that I need to do basically is to copy that configuration file into the build artifacts. So if you look at this folder, this is basically the repo in GitHub. So you can see I've got these deployment JSON file in here. So basically all I have to do is just specify that I want to copy these files from that folder into the build artifact staging directory. So this is the JSON file. And then when I publish the artifact, basically I'm publishing not only the solution zip, but also the configuration file. So if I look at one of the outputs of that build, so this is a build that I executed previously. And if we look at the published artifacts, you can see that I've got the solution zip file, but I've also got the deployment settings file. So the idea now is to basically import this solution and use the deployment settings file in the pipeline to set the connection references. So we are back to the release pipeline, and this is the basically the JSON configuration file. So as you can see, it's coming from the build artifacts. So all I had to do basically is go to browse through the build artifacts and just select the JSON file. So now this JSON file contains the metadata and the tags that we need to replace. So the only thing I have to do basically is put this task, which is replace tokens task before the import the solution task. So basically I browse to the file, to the JSON file or the folder in first, and then I specify that I want to replace all the tags in that file with the right values. So normally you have to provide the basically the pattern. So as you basically remember, I put in the @ signs before and after the tag. So basically all I have to do is basically match that in here. And then once this task runs, it's going to basically replace my parameters with the correct connection IDs. So if you're wondering what is this task, basically this task is the replace tokens task, which comes from this replace tokens Azure DevOps extension. So this is what I'm using for this demo. So where do the connection basically or the values come in, the connection IDs or the values come from? Basically, I've defined these as pipeline variables. So you can see the Dataverse connection ID is this, and the Office 365 users connection ID is that. So basically, when this task is going to run, it's going to basically replace anywhere where it's got @ you basically shared Office 365 users @ with that value. So the last step is basically to run this pipeline and the values will be replaced. So you're probably wondering where do these connection IDs come from? So I've logged into the production environment using the same account I'm using to import the solution. This is going to be the easiest way to basically make sure that the account that is importing the solution is the same account that is owning the connections, because then the account will have access to the connections. There are other ways to do it as well, which I can possibly show in future videos. But for this one, basically, I've created, I had to go into this environment and create these two connections. So one of them is the Dataverse connection and the other one is the Office 365 users connection. So in case you're wondering where do the IDs come from, so basically all I have to do is basically just go into the details of that connection. And once this page opens, you can see that the ID of the connection is basically in the top URL window. So the last part of the URL is the connection ID. So all I have to do now is just copy that connection ID and put it into my DevOps pipeline. And then, that connection will basically be linked into the flow once this solution is imported into the production environment. So at this stage, basically, all I have is just connections configured. The production environment doesn't have the solution yet. So I'm going to run the pipeline now, and hopefully the connections will be wired. So the release pipeline has completed, so the connection references should have been linked to the connections in the production environment. So as you can see, the solution has just imported. So if we click on the solution itself, let's take a look at the flows inside the solution. So let's take a look at this flow. So you can see that the connection references are now wired correctly to the connections, and I should be able to basically turn this flow on in the production environment, and it should work perfectly fine. So if we do take a look at the connections now as well, let's take a look at the Office 365 users connection. So if you go to flows using this connection and refresh the screen, you can see that the get user info flow is now using this connection. So if you remember in the beginning of the video, I mentioned that there is two ways to do these connection references. So the first way was basically to use the deployment JSON file and the Power Platform build tools. The other way is to use the Power DevOps tools. So basically, you need to add the Power DevOps tools installer task. And then there is another task in the Power DevOps tool, which is called update connection references. So this one takes a connection string, which you can use a username and password with OAuth or a service principal. In this case, I'm using the same user that was owning the connections as with the basically the Power Platform Impulse Solution task. So the difference between these two tasks is in this one, you can actually provide the JSON information and the mappings in line within the task. So in this case, you can see basically I've mapped the Office 365 users connector to this connection, and the same thing for Dataverse. So it's the same information, it's just the different ways of providing it. The other thing I've noticed is the Power DevOps tools tasks give you a bit more logging information when it comes to mapping the connections, so you can see what connections it is updating during that process. I found this information useful in the beginning when the connections weren't wired correctly, and I wanted to see what was happening during the pipeline. So I found these logs actually useful to help me troubleshoot this problem. But in general, you should be able to use both of these tasks, and they both work perfectly fine if you've got the right values in there. So just to recap, basically what we've done is we've created the JSON file which contains the mapping between the connection reference and the connections. Then we populated the connection IDs that we created in the production environment prior to the import solution into the environment variables in the pipelines. And then we executed the import, and then we've basically mapped the connections to the connection references. And then after that, we were able to basically see the information in the Power Apps Maker portal, and we were able to turn on the flow. So this brings us to the end of this demo. Hopefully you found this video useful. In future videos, I plan to show you how you can activate the flows once you wire the connection references, and also how to share the flows and share the Power Apps. So stay tuned for future videos. Thanks for watching.